Our next speaker is Dr. William Gaunatz, who is the program manager for the Delta Clipper and Single Stage to Orbit programs at McDonnell Douglas. And he's going to be continuing on our theme here. He's going to be talking about establishing the space transportation infrastructure.
Yeah, it shows up on the easily won't. It's yours that. That may help. Well, good afternoon, and appreciate being here again and talking with you all. And particularly apropos putting this session together, looking at new space applications, expansion of the space infrastructure. I want to complement those thoughts then with the fundamental space transportation infrastructure that needs to be put into place if we're going to implement, as well as equally important, be able to routinely service such space systems. So I want to first talk this afternoon a little bit about the very broad needs of and potential application to space that will demand the space transportation infrastructure, and then discuss a few thoughts on how we might go about implementing that infrastructure and putting that in context with other transportation infrastructures that we already have in place and in fact take for routine now. Some of you have heard some of this before, but I'll reiterate it by starting about talking about places and their uses. And if we look at places that we're quite familiar with, of land and sea, we see all the things that we normally and routinely do there and depend upon, everything from where we live to where we get our food. Our energy is supplied in how we transport things. Extending on into other places, air, which is less of a place and more of a medium that we use for routine transportation that is really there to service land and sea operations. And finally, space, which is full of opportunities and is really at this point only very minimally used, and mainly because, as Seth said, it's very costly both to get there and to operate once you are there. Our communications industry, probably, and to some extent the observation industry, makes the most use of it at the present time, but that industry can somewhat be likened to the trappers of the old Northwest Territories, whose beaver skins supported a thriving industry of the day, but who could never begin to imagine the real economic potential and uses to which at that time their frontier could produce. So space is going to be continue to be underused, I believe, until it's really viewed as a marvelous economic opportunity, a place to be developed and used for the benefit of mankind, and as a place that, as such, then will contribute new wealth and new jobs to our economy. Space, as I've noted before, is different from any other frontier of the past in that it's equally close to all countries and to all communities. I think that difference helps to explain really the universal appeal for space, and should have resulted by now in its very rapid development. But that development, as we know, has been deterred simply because the people, the public, the experimenters, the entrepreneurs, the risk takers simply can't get there and back, can't get their experiments there and back, can't afford the wait, can't afford the cost. And so the highest priority that we need to look for in our space activities is the establishment of a very dependable transportation to and from space, and one that will drive down the cost of transportation. So a change of how we think about space will be required. Like that in our country of Jefferson, when he ordered the Lewis and Clark expedition, his instructions to Lewis were that the object of your mission is to explore for the purpose of commerce. The thought that you blaze the trail and others will follow, that certainly has been true. The explorations indeed were followed by bold visions and actions of the pioneering public that finally did settle it. When we look at the broad set of applications that are out there, starting with communications and its expansion, and we're reading more and more about the explosion that's going to take place in terms of the low Earth orbits, the telecommunications field. That's going to continue to be expanded. In fact, the Japanese, I think later this year, are going to offer cars now with locator maps from the global positioning satellites, so that we poor husbands won't have to stop at service stations and ask for directions. And so we'll routinely know where you are any place in the world. And that infrastructure will expand. It will continue to expand as we get more dependent. Other opportunities, jobs are going to open as we begin thinking about routine servicing and repair of such satellites. Our military, which is already dependent on space, will become more so. And the theater commander is going to be able to routinely call for space cover in the same way that he or she can now call for air cover. Our military, my perspective, is somewhat like the old Army Signal Corps was sometime between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the First War, with observation balloons. We're just building bigger binoculars and more expensive balloons to get them there. But the advent of the airplane came along and opened up this marvelous thing called mobility in time and space, and military operations have never been the same. And you don't want to be second in realizing that capability. With opening space, I think will come pioneers and homesteading. One thought has been suggested that maybe the United States ought to put up a number of external tanks and offer them up for homesteading. You have 4 or 5 years to put so much improvement per year, and then it's yours to do with, and useful gain as you can put into it and your ingenuity allows. We've already talked about and heard about solar farms and those potentials. It's interesting to speculate beyond how we think now, where the choice and the availability of low-cost energy in space, we may actually find industries and processes that are going to be taken to space to take advantage of that low-cost energy. And further on down the line, in terms of being able to come up with mobile energy storage derived from space, there's marvelous work that's ongoing now in the laboratories with very high energy particle physics, and the antimatter research and storage that's going on will allow you to store in a bottle about yay big all the energy that, say, the city of Toronto would need for a year of operation. So the things are going to be different in 50 to 100 years. Refueling in space allows you to, as pointed out, once you get out of this enormous gravity well we're in, access any of the orbits and on into the moon, like starting out with lunar lava tube moon bases to begin with, expanding with the pioneering on the moon, expanding that infrastructure. Suggestions have been made for solar farms on the moon as a practical source, another source and a location for solar energy, on into mining the materials on the moon, which include also helium-3 as an energy source. Recognition has been made of the enormous mineral potentials that are floating around us in the form of asteroids. The ability to bring those back into near Earth orbit under control is, again, a tremendous source of materials. Coupling those with very low-cost energy in space, again, opens up potentials for new energy. One of the near-term applications of space and space transportation, I believe, is going to be tourism. That's always been the case. And it's going to start out first with adventures and people just wanting to go there to have the fun of space, enjoy the view, on into relaxing holidays in space. And with that, it's going to open up whole new industries, not only in space, but here on Earth, as we begin to develop spaceports and all the attendant economies that have developed around our airports and our earthbound transportation systems. Other new opportunities will open. There's really a chance for an international talk show where you can see people as you go by. Research in space, again, it's been, a lot of that's been disappointing to date. People say that it's really not a practical place to carry things out. But I think the hard facts are that the reason it's not been practical is because it's been difficult to get there. And you demand of the poor experimenter that he do the perfect experiment every time, particularly if he's a graduate student. He's only going to get one chance in his career or remain a graduate student for a long time. But the catch-22 is if he does the perfect experiment, they will say, well, how many times have you replicated it? And well, then you're caught. And you think what we're able to do on labs on Earth is to do things over and over again, optimize through experimentation. And once space is routinely available, once we have a space lab operating that can be routinely used, then manufacturing in space indeed will become a reality. We'll continue on and do things as we're doing today, except at lower cost and conventional space lift of getting satellites up into lower orbit and higher orbits. But the main thing will be that cost will no longer, and schedules will no longer be a major impediment. We'll open up into things called space logistics with routine servicing of, say, on the space station, ferrying crews back and forth, hauling students up for projects, scientists to projects, bringing experiments back on a routine basis, and generally opening space that way. Space is a marvelous place to travel, and with point-to-point transportation through space, you can talk about 2-hour block times anywhere between any two spaceport pairs in the world. And we'll be seeing international routes opening up where we'll be able to rapidly travel point-to-point around the world. I think initially for very rapid cargo delivery, and then from there expanding into passengers. You want to get to Australia, and you don't have to sit on a plane for a day and a half. You can be there in 2 hours' time or less. Probably still have to wait for your baggage. The conclusion of all this is really looking at space. Indeed, is a place. It has all the attributes of frontiers that we have opened in the past. And the leadership and bold visions at the top need to be put into place to realize that, and once in place, the pioneering public, as they've always done, are indeed going to be able to open that. Basic infrastructure development to realize that is what's required. And this really demands then that a new view about space, and viewing it as a tremendous economic opportunity, a place, a medium for operation as well as travel. And space access then needs to be put into context of a fundamental infrastructure problem. If you look at most all of the space access studies that have certainly gone on in the United States, have always been done on the basis of what is it we need to do now, and then kind of extrapolating things that we do now over the next 10 years, and deciding that based on the number of satellite launches you can calculate, that we really don't need to do much more than what we're doing today. Yeah, you'd like it to be much less costly, but since you don't fly many times a year, that cost is indeed variable versus the cost you might have to invest to make a very low-cost system. So you need to change that around as you begin to look at space from being just a set of missions and operations and satellites to being a very fundamental frontier that has to be open. To realize these visions, we need to start with a fresh perspective then of how we do think about space. Commercial space will evolve over a period of time as the pioneering entrepreneurs begin to see a sustained demonstration of space accessibility in order, as is pointed out, for the solar power systems to be realized. That fundamental cost of getting there and back and servicing needs to be overcome. The nature and quantity of the new ventures, I think, will match the transportation schedules and prices. Thus, a new perspective for government planning needs to be put into place to establish the policies and finance the technologies and system developments to establish the spaceways and as an infrastructure to support and encourage space ventures. But what the government needs to do can be derived from what the governments have done in the past for our, starting the very first administration with the waterways and the Erie canals, on into the railways, the highways, the airways infrastructure. And the government's actions have included items like providing major national technology and research assistance. Key in that, it's also been providing a stable national policy, which led to the government implementation and investment strategies. Government support role for interfacing between the transportation services and the users, as we have in our Department of Transportation, which they're there to ensure safe and fair business practices through regulation, certification, and inspection. The government's provided for military transportation development, that experience, advancements, expertise, the technologies that flow from that to be transferred readily to the commercial sector. The buzzword nowadays is defense conversion. The government has provided major funding, say for the highway infrastructure, with Federal Highways and Bridges program, a program that was originally funded for military preparedness, which directly benefited commercial transportation. Stop and think, the whole hotel, motel, fast food industry that's developed since the end of World War II is really a result of the highway and the transportation infrastructure that was opened. Again, nobody went to Holiday Inns and suggested that you ought to build the interstate highways so you can have a lot of customers. It was the other way around. Eisenhower, the administration, I never heard of Holiday Inns when they decided to go ahead with the infrastructure development. But clever businessmen and venture people did go ahead and open that, and that led to whole new industries, and with that, marvelous new segment of the economy has developed. The highways infrastructure also allowed for the full expansion of the nation's commercial automobile and trucking agency. The government's also provided major funding, over 80% for all U.S. airport planning, development, and implementation, which was necessary for the full expansion of the nation's commercial aircraft and airline industry. The government also oversees, guides, and regulates, controls the evolving transportation infrastructure. And finally, it's important to note that the government did not directly fund, provide, or develop commercial transportation systems or vehicles. They did fund and develop many of the military transportation systems, supporting technologies, vehicles, and expertise that were directly or indirectly applicable to commercial transportation systems. The U.S. government is now entering into an agreement with the automobile industry to share the risk of developing fuel-efficient cars, and will use the enormous purchasing power of the government automobile and vehicle fleets to act as an anchor tenant to nurture a market for this new technology. There are cooperative technology developments underway with the aircraft industries to develop a competitive position for a high-speed civil transport. So government actions and activities for the spaceways will need to be equally broad. Spaceways infrastructures will need to cover all space activities, including not just access to space, but a very dynamic, viable in-space infrastructure. You need to get to low Earth orbit, and then you're going to need to service segments that are at geosynchronous or in other low Earth orbits, or on into lunar operations. They'll also need to govern and monitor and help develop the whole ground infrastructures that are going to be put into place. We're going to see spaceports springing up all around the country, all around the world. The space transportations within the systems within this infrastructure need to remain tailored for all three sectors, that is, military, civil, and commercial. And it's important that such an infrastructure be designed not just to handle and pointed toward one segment alone, but really all three of those, since they all have similar needs and can be self-supporting. The payback to the government for any infrastructure development has always been direct and enormous. And it's not that they're going to get money necessarily back from operating a space system, but they're going to get money back from the revenue that's generated from the people who then are able to develop new systems, operate profitably space systems back in terms of the payback in terms of the increased tax revenues. The DoD's space operations need in the next century may be the most urgent, but there is a better commercial economic payoff for the nation if the space transportation services are commercially provided to whomever needs them. DoD could initiate space transportation leadership with a planned transition to commercial operations, except for those missions that are traditionally reserved for the military. Who's going to fund the development of a space transportation system for the next century? Even though a dominant space transportation requirement at the start of the century may be for military space operations on behalf of our national security, there's over 2/3 of the dollars that are spent in the U.S. for space transportation are involved in the shuttle operation for our civil program. Thus, a cooperative program between DoD and NASA, which will service DoD's support missions, the shuttle replacement, NASA shuttle replacement, space station logistics, crew rotation, planet Earth missions, space exploration missions, and finally establishing the basis of a competitive U.S. international commercial space services market. Therefore, all of these users, industry included, needs to share in this development burden. As we head towards the next century, we're already seeing within the communications industry on the satellite side of being a very visionary and outward-looking set of entrepreneurs. And we're seeing a myriad of innovative commercial satellite services that are being introduced that will really, again, transform the way we do business here on Earth. The pace of these expanded space commercialization, however, has been deterred owing to the present difficulty, cost, reliability, scheduling with the space transportation systems. Therefore, the government should be compelled by their economic vision and recognition of this very large emerging high technology satellite market alone to get started on developing spaceways infrastructure. And I think as the future major systems like the solar energy becomes better known, the feasibility established, again, those will be other compelling reasons for the government to want to move forward. So let's take a look at what some of those government roles might be. And they are traditional roles and things that they have done in the past. Must be I'm through.
Might be we're all through.
Or we're all through. Chairman, what do we do?
Nobody's doing it.
We continue.
Until it becomes constant, don't worry about it.
Okay.
Give her what it is.
Well, we take a look at the call a multimedia presentation. The government roles that need to be played in developing the spaceways are derived from a perspective of what the government's done in the past, and that's kind of been a phased development. Most importantly, starting with the vision or a recognition of what is out there in space, in this case to be developed, and then establishing the policies, strategies for helping to implement that. Going on into assisting in the implementation of that, making certain that the key technologies, developments, current infrastructures are in place to support that. And then, again, helping is an anchor tenancy role to provide that initial pull to nurture the market as it develops. And then continuing on, maintaining it, watching it as it grows, acting as a moderator, and in the moderator role and the regulation role, and continuing to look after other things like environmental compliance. I suggest that we really don't need lots of new organizations developed to do this, but they can be accomplished within the structure of our present organizations. In fact, I think helping to normalize, one thing that would help to normalize space would be to get it out from under just strictly a NASA domain, strictly a DoD domain, get it into the commercial domain where Department of Transportation, Department of Commerce now are dominant players in our space development, our space policies, and our space regulations. And so indeed, we can make use of the organizations, agencies that are already in place to help.
Don't worry about it unless it goes continuous. Okay? Don't worry about it unless the fire alarm goes continuous. Okay? Then you head to the closest exit. Okay? Back to the road. Don't worry about it.
All right. Okay. Wish you would have come in sooner. The payback from doing all this, again, we've talked, are indeed enormous. For the government, there's immediate reduction in the space transportation costs. The United States today spends about $6 billion a year, of which about $4 billion of that is in our space shuttle operations. So there's a lot of money that can be saved, redirected into further space development if we can offload those costs. Enormous increase in operational flexibility for security forces, helping open up new operations as well as new security policies for them. and contributing to the long-term economic growth with new jobs. With industry helping us regain a market share, and probably more importantly, really help to expand that market to become just a small niche market where we are now, become a major player, such as our airlines industries are today, and with that being able to open up an enormous commercial space market. In our country, there's been a lot of talk about needing a space czar in the government someplace to look after and dictate what are the priorities, what goes on first. I would suggest that the real space czar needs to be expanded and become the marketplace. With infrastructure development has always led to business development, and as talked before, in the case of waterways, railways, highways, on airways, that's been the case. And there's no reason to expect that the spaceways won't lead to that same type of development. With the opening of the spaceways, the military is going to be assured of its freedom, ability of action, and defense of the country and its allies. NASA is going to be relieved from the enormous burden it must now shoulder in operating being a developer and an operator, and being able to focus on the technology developments, space science and space exploration. And business can get on with doing the job it needs to do, opening space for the public and for the purposes of creating new jobs. The government roles of implementation really require a visionary government policies that recognize the importance of developing a spaceways infrastructure. With this leadership and focus, government will be able to establish and implement the policies, resources, and research necessary to enable industry to develop the capabilities, and will ultimately allow the public, every man, woman, and child of it, the opportunity to travel to and from space, be it for business or simply pleasure. I suggest that having this capability within 10 years would be instantly embraced by the public as a national goal for space. The space will not be opened merely by dabbling around at the margins of today's transportation costs, nor will space ever be opened by always leaving it to another generation. I think our generation does have the knowledge, the tools, the materials in hand to open space, and not to do so is simply to leave a legacy of limits. Opening of the spaceways can change space from being just a program to being a national opportunity and a new source of economic strength. Our team's vision from the beginning and remains is to open up the space highways, the spaceways, and getting to that is getting the hardware out and flying. So I'll conclude and take any questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wondered, do you have any approximate schedule on the test flights, or are you going to be talking about that at a later session?
We'll be talking about that tomorrow, but our next series of flights we hope to start around the 11th of June. Very shortly.
You're talking about
For a
Delta Clipper?
for a spaceport, what sort of infrastructure would you expect would be required, say if a Delta Clipper type of production vehicle were flying on it? What kinds of infrastructure would you expect to be required for a spaceport?
Here's one is might be open to Japan. Typical. Looks kind of like an airport. Different facilities for fuels and propellants that you use. But other facilities are very similar. You'll need maintenance hangars, flight operations control, places for handling your payload, cargo, eventually passenger terminals, areas set aside for your flight stands, which are effectively your gates for operation and for landing, for vertical landing systems such as the and ground facilities would indeed be similar to what we're accustomed today in handling airlines.
The DCY, what is the size of the cargo area for the skid? Would that be big enough to launch the solar power satellites and the things they want to launch, or we have to go back to the shuttle or a Saturn V style launcher?
Go back to what my comment was on letting the kind of the market dictate your development. It appears that the first system that would be out there and operating might actually be tailored for the small satellite industry, growing from that into the medium class vehicles, which are about 10 to 12 tons to orbit. And if you're looking at 20, 30 tons to orbit, then you would build correspondingly larger vehicles. But it's kind of like our commercial aircraft division at Douglas, in servicing it, customers has, MD-80s, started with DC-9s and MD-80s, and stretched MD-80s and 90s, and DC-10s and MD-11s. And the airliners then that operate those pick the plane that suits their particular market in terms of the size cargo. As far as we can tell, there's really no fundamental limitations in terms of how these vehicles scale. They do not scale directly proportional, fortunately, to payload. It's about a square law scaling. And so what will happen, the vehicle will simply get larger as larger payloads, and you go to that as the frequency and demand for larger payloads being on the vehicle. Again, that's one of the things that we have to look at in terms of change in thinking how we operate. Is today we classify light, medium, and heavy lifters, concluding that if I want to put up a big satellite, I have to take it all in one trip, because that trip is going to cost me a couple, $300 million, so I want to be very effective with that trip. The other way to achieve heavy lift is to take 2 or 3 trips. And if you're only paying $1 to $10 million a trip, then you can afford to take a lot of trips. And you'll design your satellites, your space systems accordingly to take advantage of the lower cost transportation infrastructure. So it will open up new trade space, if you will, for the people who are using space to consider how they would make use of the transportation infrastructure. Yes, sir?
If the government doesn't come up with more funding, will the project end, or will McDonnell Douglas be able to fund it themselves?
At this stage, I think the project would dwindle down. And again, the reason is economic, in that with the market as it does exist, and those that you can take to the bank, so to speak, is pretty murky in terms of justifying a major expenditure. Going back to the highways analogy, Rocky Mountain Express makes a lot of money traveling from Denver to Los Angeles every day. But that resulted as a fact of the government infrastructure being in place that allowed them to do that. So what you're kind of asking is, would industry be willing to foot the bill for an interstate highway in order to effectively operate a truck over that network? And the answer from the investment community is thanks, but no thanks.
It's not quite the same as the interstate highway. It's more like the first car as compared to the first and buggy.
Somewhat of that effect, but much more interdependent now, in that first car could drive around on wagon tracks, and there were a lot of people. There was a transportation infrastructure in place then that was looking to be serviced by more effective ways. And there just is not that market pull yet that you can go to the bank with that says having that in place, we could count on this type of revenue. And I guess that's part of what you're looking for, and has been a traditional government role, is to help establish and nurture that market, similar to what they're doing in the low emissions, cleaner automobiles, in providing the initial stimulus for the development, and then providing an anchor tenancy, if you will, for the initial purchasing until the public gets introduced to them and understands what they are, and the market can go off on its own. So we're still back in that pump prime mode. It's one, as an advocate, that you passionately like to go ahead and do, until you look at the hard numbers that are there. For example, we have looked at the development of a first fleet of vehicles, and that's about on the same order of magnitude as developing a new commercial airliner, $6-7 billion. If you look at the payback time that would be required, because not only are you the reason you're developing it is to lower the cost, and so to realize the reason for developing it, you're going to have to offer lower cost per flight. And so the payback period to industry stretches out just to break-evens on the order of out to 15, 20 years. And again, that's not a terribly attractive market. Now, if we had a solar power system waiting to go, and that's one of the reasons of linking these together this afternoon, is what reusable systems want is our systems up there with lots of flight opportunities. The more you fly them, the lower the cost, the quicker you can also recover your investments. And so it really is bootstraps itself and becomes an elastic market going forward. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd just throw a comment, and I think another effect it's faced is that the aerospace industry has gone through a great deal of changes. You now have subsidized competition from places like the Airbus and such, which basically massive amounts of money from France and Germany and such went into creating an airliner to compete. And they probably could not have broken into the market without the subsidies. And the end result of that is there are more manufacturers than the market really needs, and that cuts down McDonnell Douglas's profits, which might have been able to have been plowed into projects such as this.
Yeah, it's right. It's a very interdependent and complex world. One of the reasons that space station is so very, very vital to space transportation is that it offers the nearest in opportunity that can be defined for a very high flight rate operation, upwards of 40 to 50 flights a year in terms of servicing it. And at those types of flight rates, private investment starts becoming a feasible thing to do. And without a space station or a solar power station or something equivalent, if you're counting 3, 4, 5 flights a year with no guarantee of those, it becomes difficult for industry to go ahead with it, let alone as we've seen that the government has shown a reluctance to make the investment. Yes, sir.
I can't help but think that you're putting your cart before your horse in some of your discussion. You just mentioned the space station as being an opportunity to develop space transportation system. I don't think that that's an opportunity so much as a requirement. If you define the space station as being in existence, or being a desirable thing to do, then you must have some kind of transportation system. But that's not really what we're talking about in cheap access to space. When we're talking about cheap access to space, we're talking about given an inexpensive way to get into space, then the universe will follow.
Yeah, and
Please, let me finish.
Go ahead.
You were using as an analogy, the spaceway as an analogy, with the canal system and the highway system, the railroad system, and the airline system. I don't think that's a good analogy, because in each one of those cases, you're concerned with getting from point A to point B. If you can't take a canal boat, you take an ox cart. If you can't take an ox cart, then you take a cargo airplane or a railroad. But that's not what we're doing when we're talking about getting to access to space. We're talking about leaving the world entirely. And it's more, I think a better analogy would be for a small nation with one single seaport. If that analogy is at all valid, then maybe one spaceport would be all that would be required on Earth. Maybe. We can arm wrestle that, details of that later. I'm afraid that you, in your position with McDonnell Douglas, is still using old thinking on the matter. You're thinking in terms of developing a big airline. Man, I can't use a 747, but I might be able to use a Piper Cub.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with what you're saying. The difficulty is in the transition of getting from where we are today, which has been 30 years of space development, but we do not have a usable public infrastructure in place today because space was developed for other reasons. We do have a tremendous heritage of technology and capabilities that are there, and we simply need to look at applying those differently. The difficulty comes in getting from where we are to where we want to be with Piper Cubs on up to 747s, and we really don't have the Piper Cub yet. And but developing that Piper Cub still takes money, and those that believe it can be done for very little money are kind of subject to the Music Man type of thinking, that if you just think the tune, you can play it on your trumpet. It's a little more difficult than that, and it does take a lot of investment to achieve the type of transportation that you want, cheap. But cheap also has to be reliable and safe. We want spaceports to spring up, not just one port, but you'd like to see those spring up around the world as the needs and the demands result. And to do that, you're going to have in that the same type of safety as most all of us experienced as we flew up here on various airlines and airplanes. And that unfortunately takes investment and money up front. And it's not that we don't know how to do it, it's that we need to set aside and put our minds to doing that. But space is also, in the whole scheme of the world's economy, is a pretty minuscule thing. And so convincing other people, bankers, the government, you name them, that this is a good investment versus buying an apartment complex or developing a new shopping mall or starting a new automobile and so on, for which there are proven markets, is a tough thing to do right now. And so what I'm suggesting is that the start of development of these very fundamental infrastructures we need, it is a legitimate concern, a legitimate obligation that governments have always performed. And I've talked to, and part of the point I was trying to make in talking to it as infrastructure is to avoid the pitfall we get into in justifying new space developments. And our own DOD went through that. Some of you may have heard of this bottoms-up review they did. And what that simply amounted to finally was they counted up the number of satellites they had to launch. And they got them on a couple of hands and said, is it worth our investing $3, $4, $5, $6, $7 billion to significantly reduce the cost per year of putting those up? Well, going to Congress, going to the American people, and going to any taxpayer with an opportunity to spend a lot of money now to save money downstream is a very, very difficult argument to make. And I suggest that you only do that based on, it's a leadership policy that says, I know this is right for us to go do. And so you put that plan into place and you rally your public behind it, and then maybe it occurs in 5 years, maybe the payoff isn't for 10 years. And that's what's very difficult to try to quantify when this thing called cheap space is really going to be here, when it's really going to affect our daily lives. And when it does start affecting everybody's daily lives, we'll really have cheap access to space. One of the analogies I've used on my NASA friends at times is the analogy that supposing we had an air program today, and it consisted of a dozen aeronauts that flew an airplane from Buffalo, New York to Denver, 8 times a year, and reported back to the public all the great sites there were there, and did upper atmosphere research and talked about their air turbulence. How much public support would there be? We'd be here talking about cheap access to air. But that's where we are, is the analogy. And so we haven't thought beyond space and just what we've been doing with it today. And so we need to break through it. And unfortunately, the fundamentals to it, and your chart is right on. We're in this huge hole. And we simply have to get out of there reliably and eventually cheaply to really make space go. But I'm not just disagreeing with what you're saying. The object of this really is to get to cheap space. The difficulty is how do we get out of where we've been for 30 years and make that transition that's going to allow us to financially get there. Yes?
We want to talk about defense conversion. Why do you think that there hasn't been more emphasis on projects like SSTO in the government?
Well, because space is not very important in the national agenda, compared to health care, compared to automobiles, compared to just about everything. There's a lot of interest in space, for no other reason than the heritage we have in it, what we've done in the United States, for example, in the lunar program. Everybody remembers that. Nobody wants to give that up. But nobody, the government, and the government's the public, doesn't really see a payoff for making further investments. And so that's, we're back in this real chicken and egg process of trying to find the pump to get there. And it's only going to take one demonstration and one program that, to make it really happen. I think one of the most exciting things that's happening right now is people are beginning to look at extensive use of the low Earth orbit telecommunication systems. And again, they're going to be creating an infrastructure there that's going to have to be maintained, serviced, as well as implemented. And that may be the initial bootstrapping activity that will really help space develop. Hi.